Honestly, I never really expected this to catch on as much as it has. In fact, if you consider the viewership figures for these 4 long patrols, it hasn't. It's been about what I expected. It hasn't done as well as the other videos, the sexier videos, the ones which are about ships which blow things up. But it has caught on in that the people who have watched these videos have really seeming to engaged and enjoyed, which has made me smile a lot. And the thing that's made me engage and enjoy most of all is some people have sent me through photos and holiday snaps of things they've gone and seen and gone, oh, look, this is this piece of infrastructure. This is what this has been doing. And I love that. I was hoping to include some in today's video, but I may end up having to do a 5th one to include them all. I'm not sure. I didn't because this has already got 21 slides. And that makes it pretty darn cool as far as I'm concerned, but it also means it's going to be a little bit over an hour, and I do try and make these long patrols roughly an hour. I find if they are 60 to 70 minutes, that's about right for most people. If they're shorter than that, that's fine, but 60 to 70 is about the limit. So, here's, of course, the Royal Navy, and we've already been over this several times, but the Royal Navy is spread out around the world. And its major advantage for fighting a global war is it has global infrastructure. Its major disadvantage for fighting a global war is it has global infrastructure and it needs to maintain it in peacetime. When everyone usually goes, well, are we using it right now? No, then we can save money and we can use it for other things like lower taxes or, which is that bad, or we can spend it on this project or that project, or maybe we can spend it on, something worthwhile, schools and hospitals, which are all worthy things. But the trouble is, kind of like schools and hospitals, if you don't invest in them in the times when they're not under pressure, then when they are under pressure, they tend to crack and creak and break completely. It's the same with infrastructure. Invest in it when it's not under pressure and it'll survive when it is. Try and crash invest when it is under pressure, and the two things together will probably break it completely. What is the limitation on naval infrastructure? Well, it's the size of ship which can go in there. Again, this comes back to often my heard refrain about 20,000 ton cruisers, sort of 15 to 20,000 ton heavy cruiser. That model would have worked very well for the RN. Why? Because there is a huge amount of infrastructure which can deal with ships of that size very efficiently. Now, they can deal with ships smaller than that quite well. That doesn't bother them. But the thing is, you want to get the most efficient usage of the space available. And if you've got something which can take 15 to 20,000 tons and maintain it, then you want something that's worth 15 to 20,000 tons to be maintained in it. At least occasionally. But the problem is, the treaty system, battleships are allowed to be up to 35,000 tons. Yeah, we know how many people actually follow that. And cruisers have to be less than 10,000 tons. Again, we know how many actually follow that. This is a lovely big gap, but in that gap sits a lot of Royal Navy infrastructure, which means I've not really paid attention to, because honestly, something which is only going to take 10,000 tons on a regular basis doesn't have to be maintained to the same level that something's going to take up to 20,000 tons on a regular basis. It still needs to be maintained and it's all okay, but the thing is, the level it's going to have to sustain is far less. It's designed for far greater than it's actually going to be used to. So you can cut corners on costing again. A constant refrain. But there's one problem with all these spaces. As wonderful as they are, not all of them are created equally from a geographical perspective. There are these lovely dry docks and graving docks, after all. The land version of a dry dock are built around them. And some of them, this is an earlier one. There are far more built by the point into war years, but their utility is something we have to consider. For starters, some are civilian owned and operated and all focused on civilian work, so will only really be available for emergency use in wartime when the government assumes the requisite powers. In peacetime, it's book or not. Plus, the fact is, the civilian ones, they're put in places where there's a large amount of civilian traffic which will sustain them. That makes sense financially. But that might not be where you want them if you're a Navy. Yes, you want to protect your sea lines of communication, which means you are going to have ships in those areas, but you also have other strategic interests you might want to protect. You might want to have a heavier presence in an area which has smaller sea lines of communication. If you're India on the part routes of India to Britain, there are lots of commercial venues as well as naval venues which you can call upon. Once you're past India, it starts getting more thin on the ground. It's also the same once you're past a certain point in the Atlantic and you're going the other way around the world. Because again, you don't need infrastructure in the Middle Atlantic because for merchant ships, because you have all the American infrastructure on one side and the British infrastructure on the other side, plus some French and some Dutch and even some Scandinavian infrastructure. So you have all that. You don't need it, therefore. However, if you're the Royal Navy, you can't really start using American commercial infrastructure in peacetime. And in wartime, well, you have to consider always the possibility of the worst case scenario of ending up actually at war with the US. And when I say worst case scenario, I mean that's in the 20s and 30s. That's a who knows how that would have happened. I know there are people who like to play up that one as a reality, including Roskill, but I doubt it. I really doubt it. It's people looking at the German naval race and the Anglo-German portion of the Dreadnought race and going, well, then America and Britain were competing post World War One, and that could have led to war. Well, that would A, require the US Navy getting funding consistently from Congress. B, would have meant the US having to expand their construction program dramatically, considering how much of a numerical advantage the British had built up. And C, and possibly this is the most important of all, there is the reality that for Britain, America building a navy wasn't necessarily a threat. It was a problem in that they had to consider it in strategic occasions. But the fact is, America is the other side of the Atlantic and is half on the other side in the Pacific. America has huge maritime borders, huge areas of sea, which are its defensive depth. It having a navy and wanting a strong navy is something which is rational and understandable to the British strategic psyche and political psyche. The problem with the German navy when it was being built was it was being built up A, against the British, and the British knew it. B, Germany went from being a traditional ally to being a possible threat. And C, problematic because they were that close to the UK. And they meant the British had to focus everything on that. Because basically the Germans had a very small portion of the North Sea they were exposed to, and the rest was in the Baltic. The Americans have huge coasts they have to defend. The British are very capable and very coherent about the idea of tying down a rather short leg, let's be honest, because the American ships were not exactly that long ranged, fleet the other side of the ocean. They were not so worried about that. Canada would have been squashed, but eventually it wouldn't have been a quick walkover for the US. I realise there are people who will find that particularly upsetting to them, but let's be honest, the Canadians, as polite as they are at this period we're talking about, have equivalent number density of firearms per head as the Americans do, And whilst the American forces would be mobilized, the actual infrastructure to go into Canada and past certain points in Canada is not going to allow for rapid movement of personnel. They're a lot bigger distances than Europe. One of the most interesting things, of course, is the US gets rid of all their horse-mounted cavalry, which would actually been quite useful for a war in Canada in the 1920s. We'll leave that to one side. Yeah, they did that so they could invest in tanks, which would have probably broken down quite a lot, not that far into Canada. Ah, the joys of history and the joys of strategic hindsight. We know what the truth is. We can look back and laugh. So, floating docks. Can they take a battleship? Well, here is HMS Erin. And that's at Gordon in 1918, and that's not the only one the British have that can take a battleship. And as you can see, that floating dock can actually take a far bigger ship than Erin. It's designed to. Because if you position it right, you can have either end of the ship sticking out over that floating dock. So she can take battle cruisers. In some respects, floating docks are more useful, and they're today's discussion, than graving docks. Okay. A graving dock has an interesting thing in that it's very difficult because it's basically made of concrete to actually damage. Your only option is to take out the gates. But and compared to a floating dock, which of course is floating, and therefore it's basically another ship, so stick another hole in it. However, the problem with a floating dock and sticking another hole in it is it literally is designed to sink and then float up again. So that means it has a lot of subdivision, a lot of strength in that hull shape, and actually thinking it's going to be quite interesting. It's not impossible, but it's going to require work. As in sinking it in a way that it's not going to be able to recover. It'll be delayed in work. It won't be out of action. It won't be out of action forever, though. So it's an interesting scenario. And floating docks are important. They were important for a long time. They had been around since, conceptually, longer than most people think about. But in the case of the Bermuda one, which is the one we're talking about today, 1869 was the first time the dock reached there. It had been ordered considered from the early 1860s as a viable thing to strengthen Bermuda. Bermuda is a lovely place. Building a dockyard there was considered, a graving dock. But, for various reasons, not actually cost being one, they decided to go, as you can see. You can see Bermuda and it's a lovely location there. That's very strategically important for the Royal Navy. They went with a floating dock. They're putting a floating dock in Bermuda. Why would they need a floating dock in Bermuda? What kind of fleet are they thinking about supporting? Well, it's in the 1860s, so it's a response to the American Civil War. It's a response to the issues that have arisen up there for the British at that time period with the Union government and their various actions over various interesting ships. And so the British are sending a floating dock there. But there's a thing. There's an advantage to sending a floating dock. You can always move it. They wanted a floating dock there, and they wanted a dock facilities in Bermuda in case they needed them. But they also wanted the political option of being able to remove them should they need to. And removing a graving dock, well, yeah, you've got rid of the gates, but the dock's still sitting there. You just have to restore the gates and it's back at work. And you can even do even better than that. You can just use a Cassian and sink a Cassian in there, or a caisson, and that will work. Whereas a floating dock can be floated off. Can then be floated back if you need to, but, well, that's quite an operation. This is Admiralty Floating Dock number 1. When it's built, it is the second largest floating dock in the world. The second largest. There is interesting stats about it and the largest, and I'm not going to get into too much discussion on the largest floating dock in the world at this point, but let's safe to say that its owner was not a million miles away from the one who owned the second largest, in my opinion anyway. What was its purpose? Well, to allow the Royal Navy to operate its big ships out of Bermuda. Not a large squadron. A large squadron required more than one dock, but a significant squadron to be based there. Because if there's a floating dock there and the ships can be got out of water, then a lot of preventative maintenance can be done quite quickly when ships on station. So instead of them having to come back to the UK, or we consider the earlier options, go all the way up to Halifax, which can get very cold, or down to Kingston and Trinidad, which don't themselves have that big of facilities, they can move along. They can go straight to Bermuda. And actually, if you consider the American and West India station, or the North America station, as it was at some points in this period we're discussing, Bermuda is very nicely located. It's a nice spot in the center. It's a defensible spot in the center. It moved to place. Now, there is an interesting discussion here because the paintings I have, and these particular paintings, they come from the Dawlish Chronicles site, which is a rather cool site to go and look at, and I always recommend people go and have a look at them. Well, this shows Warrior and Black Prince with Terrible astern towing the dock. You also see there are other ships in the background. It's a sort of little flotilla. Now, those other ships are Northumberland and Agincourt. And there's an interesting difference. If we go to the Bermuda Attraction site, which is... I'm not quite sure of its relations with the Bermuda Tourism Agency, but it does seem to have some connections, something going on. They listed as being towed by Northumberland and Agincourt, and assisted in their towing by Warrior and Black that were assisted in towing by Warrior and Black Prince. Again, Terrible is listed as guiding at astern. So I think probably that all the big ships, all 4 of them, took turns in towing, and as they made it across, or assisting the towing. And I think Warrior and Black Prince are the show-off pieces, and so they get a lot more credit, and they get in the picture. But this is the thing. It's being towed to station. It is constructed and then towed to station. And it's a cool thing. What they wanted was it had to be able to take ships up to 10,000 tons, which included British new ironclads. It had to be able to be careened itself. The design was 380 feet long, 120 feet separation between its vertical sides, and it could accommodate vessels which were longer than its own length because it had strength the whole way along. And it displaced itself 8,400 tons. So it had to be able to support in the water in itself more than 18,000 tons when you consider its own weight and the ship it was carrying. you can actually see in this picture, I think, you can see terrible glimpse through it. And the painting was apparently done from HMS Warrior. I think it's imagined from HMS Warrior myself, as I would presume it would be slightly more off center than that. But no, they towed it at an average speed of 4.8 knots across the Atlantic. Although they managed to break 6 knots on 2 occasions. So, you know, that's a fast-moving thing. It's also a reason why you send quite so many large ships with it. There are, of course, the risk of storms and other things and tow line snapping. But it's a slow-moving target. And it's a very important ship. It's a very important piece of infrastructure, which you're getting into position. Agincourt, Northumberland did the first leg of the tow, definitely. And Warrior and Black Prince did the second leg of the tow, and it was divided at Madeira. But again, they all seem to be with it the whole way through, and at points it seems to be listed as Warrior and Black Prince are assisting on the first leg, and also Northumberland and Agincourt assisted and the second leg. So I presume it's just whichever one is whichever ships happen to be doing the best at that time. As we can see, you are not just performing maintenance on the ships, and it is preventative maintenance, you're also performing maintenance on yourself. In this case, she's being careened by selectively flooding, tipping her over, and cleaning her hull. This is because the water in Bermuda is considered particularly harsh for fouling ships. Rather nice of them to describe it as that. But in terms of maintaining ships, these docks are very, very useful. They're open at both ends. They are able to be arranged so they can be easy access for ships to float in. They go down. The ship gets lifted up. As long as you've got the right things in the right spots that will hold it and tie it in place, it's a very safe procedure. Allows you to get the ship out of the water. Allows you to maintain its hull. Inspect it fully. There are all sorts of things you're able to do once you can get a ship out of water. And floating docks become a big part of the Royal Navy. This is another reason why sometimes the Royal Navy seems kind of weird in its approach to graving docks, in that you would expect them to be far more pushy on graving docks than they are. But to an extent, they always seem to have it in their mind, oh, if we really need to, we can build some more floating docks. They do build them in World War I and World War II. They build floating docks. It's one of those things which isn't really considered, but if you think about the great big exercise they do in terms of constructing the huge concrete pontoons and systems which are used for the Mulberry harbours, well, to an extent, quite a lot of that technology and ideas is what does a floating dock do? It docks down to let the ships in and picks them up, and it tries to stay in one spot. And yeah, there are a lot of similarities going on. So here is what the floating dock, which was built for Bermuda, would do. And this is what's an important thing. It's selling it to not just the British public, but the British Parliament. In fact, this is a picture of the original one. This is it pictured in 1900 with HMS Psyche in. So, as you can see, it can tilt itself to be careened. It can take large ships. It can take small ships. It can act as a simple fitting out dock and maintenance dock for a large ship. It can take a large ship completely out the water. It can do what it's needed to do. Which is important. Again, it goes back to preventative maintenance, and it goes back to maintaining your fleet. There is no point in having on the wall a list of saying, yes, we have 300 ships. How many of those are current in terms of their capabilities, and how many of those current vessels are maintained and ready for operations? Those are the two questions, because that's your real fleet strength. How many ships do you have current capabilities, and how many of those ships are maintained for actual operations? To do that, well, you can run two forms of maintenance. You can run, oh sugar, it's broke, we need to fix everything maintenance, or you can run, this will probably break in another 100,000 revolutions. That's about one trip from here to Portsmouth. Let's rip it out and replace it. Those are your options. One is more expensive up front, but cheaper long term. One tends to lead to broken ships. You can guess which is which. With these facilities, they expand Britain's ability to go around the world. They expand Britain's presence. But these floating docks are always part of the battle when it comes to ships. Graving docks, floating docks are part of the battle in terms of the Royal Navy making sure it has the ships and the capabilities available it needs for operations globally. Because if you don't have these sorts of facilities, if you don't have these sorts of infrastructure, you aren't actually viable. Today, it often is taken down to things like the fleet auxiliary, i.e., how many supply ships do you have? That's your global operations capability. And that is true, because if you don't have the supplies to operate globally, you're never going to do that. But that's also a very short-term approach to operating globally, because you should also think about how do you sustain those operations globally. Are those ships going to need to return home? Are they going to go to have to go to Allied ports and use Allied facilities? If they go to Allied facilities, do the Allies have enough facilities to maintain their existing fleet and keep it going, as well as support your fleet? Do they? It's more complicated than just putting a little pin on a map and going, there be a graving dock there. Cute. Or there be a floating dock there. Cute. How is that floating dock currently used? Because it's probably not being maintained there for the good of its own health, or your health if it's being maintained by someone else. War is a complicated beast. Peace is just as complicated. Get it wrong, you can lose a lot of people far too quickly. Now, floating docks came in various sizes, but this is a nice sort of description from 1909. It's their shaping and what they are. We have Bermuda, which it was opened in 1902, has a lifting power of ordinary of 15,500 tons and a maximum lift of 17,500 tons. So this is the 1902 one, of course, is the second Bermuda floating dock. The Rotterdam one, lifting power of, I would say, that's 15,600 tons, which was being run by the Rotterdam Municipality. And then in Durban, well, it opened in 1904, but only saw a listing power of roughly 8,300 tons. And Kobe, lifting power of 12,000 tons. So there are people who are building these things not to take the maximum or the maximum they can imagine, but to take a certain amount. And again, this makes sense. Floating docks are incredibly expensive to maintain and keep going in terms of the figure. They are incredible once you were, the outlay figure. When you are actually operating them and using them as part of your fleet as preventative maintenance, the overall costs, they bring down the expense because they allow you to do the preventative maintenance. But a graving dock is kind of cheaper to keep going. In that a graving dock, the machinery can all sit in a nice brick building, or maybe in a sort of space out of underground, be protected from the elements, kept nice and fettled and cared for by a couple of people, and the concrete just sits there. Occasionally you might need to do some work on the gates. But a floating dock you have to actually do more maintenance on. You need to, of course, do the same maintenance as you would to a ship. You need to check the hull, you need to check all the facilities. And you've got the fact that this is something which is actually designed to duck down and then come up. Which means it's designed to flood and then dry itself out. Which means salt water gets everywhere. And where salt water goes, usually corrosion follows, especially if there's any dings and scrapes and bumps and, oh, what are we doing? Heavy duty maintenance on ships, which we bring in by literally floating them in. Imagine. I wonder if there's any bumps, scrapes, and dings. This is the 1902 dock when it was being built. It looks good, doesn't it? It does. It's the 1902 dock being built is something rather special. But again, if we go back to this one, the 1902 dock could take, at maximum capacity, 17,500 tons in 1902. With a little bit of upgrading, it could probably take 20,000 tons. Yes, you would need to do some upgrading, but honestly, to get something from being able to lift 17,500 tons to 20,000 tons is a lot easier than possibly building a whole new one. And considering they did modify and upgrade quite a lot of these things over time, they probably could have done it. On site in Bermuda. This is just some of the infrastructure around the world. In 1902, the Royal Navy is building dry docks with that capacity. So those dry docks are there in the 1930s. In every few years, they are looking at their dry docks. They are looking at their floating docks, their graving docks, and assessing their capacity and working out if they need to upgrade them. And they do upgrade them. This is the thing. They have to. They realise this, and they don't have a choice. They regularly schedule upgrade sessions. A floating dock into, let's consider the 1902 one. It ends up being with the Admiralty in Bermuda until built by Swan Hunter at the Wallsend Yard. It's yard number 262. Its dimensions are 545 feet by 99 feet by 33 feet. Whilst it didn't have engines, it's constructed of steel, and it's with the Admiralty in 1902. It is taken to Montevideo in 1946, stays in Montevideo till roughly 1989 when it's broken up. It's a very capable system. It was originally supposed to be designed for 11,700 tons, and at the time of her launch was the world's largest floating structure in 1902. However, she then had an end section launched and various other things added on, and she would dock 142 ships in 1944 alone. Her in-service date was delayed by the completion of the breakwater and berth, and in 1925 she was assigned the pennant number Admiralty Floating Dock Number 1. But yes, by 1909, with sections added on and various things increased, she had got to, as you can see here, 17,500 tons. And they were considering upgrading her more. This is her design. It's a very simple design, but it's effective. The actual shaping of the, well, we'll call it the pontoon section, means that she is able to be towed at sea at higher speeds than some of the previous counterparts have been. She has pontoon, she has sidewall structures, she is a interesting assembly point of various factors. And as you can see, this is a design which is roughly equivalent to the original design. She grows. And she becomes more and more capable as time goes on. This is something which you cannot overstate with floating dry docks. If you invest in them, kind of like if you invest in graving docks, but far more easily in floating docks, they can become more and more capable as time goes on because you can add on more bits. You can't really do that with a graving dock because to do that, you have to dig out and add on sections, which can mean you have to build a whole island in case of hull Berlin. It can mean you have to dig up people's houses, or you have to completely change the strata and the structure of the soils around it, like you did at Harl and the Wolf in Belfast. These things are all possible, but they all cost money. Whereas with a floating dock, sometimes what you do is literally build a new section, float it over, and weld it on. I am not kidding. That is what they did with some of them. If you ever want to be freaked out about some of the things they did with some of these objects, you read through the transactions of the Institute of Naval Architects describing these things, and they put it in such mild terms. We decided this particular floating dock needed to be so and so extended, and so this was this. We added on. We built these sections. We took them out and we attached them. Okay. It all sounds nice and easy when put like that. This is an incredibly complicated piece of machinery. You're adding bits on. Way to go. Now, of course, it wasn't sent out across the world to Bermuda without being tested. Meet Sans Pareil. Yes, she is the testing. She is being used to test the dock. It was delayed going out. It was launched in 1902, but it was delayed going out to Bermuda till roughly 1906 by the breakwater, etc., and various other things. But in the meantime, the Royal Navy found a lot of use for her on the Medway. She was tested a lot. And she was useful because she was tested. And of course, there's the advantage of while you're testing her, you get practical use of her doing preventative maintenance on the ships of the Channel Fleet. So win, 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 win. for the Royal Navy. They like those kinds of odds. They make them happy. So here are some of the Admiralty floating docks they had around the world. We had, of course, number 1. Now, this is a rather interesting thing because it's its internal listing capacity is 11,700 tons, but this is from an earlier source, and then there's the later document which has it going up higher. It's fun times. So again, you have to take some of these capacities with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Admiralty floating dock number 2 doesn't have its capacities listed. I couldn't find them in the document this was originally from, and I couldn't find them, what was going on. So it's Admiralty floating dock number 4 is one of the big girls. She's capable of doing 32,000 tons lifting capacity, 680 feet long. But Admiralty floating dock number 3 is designed to lift 3 submarines or to lift destroyers. What's also interesting is where they're built by. There's a lot by Swan Hunter. There's a lot built by certain dockyards on the Tyne. That seems to be a very core spot for the RN to go to. There's Admiralty floating dock number 9. Put in Singapore, able to lift 55,000 tons capacity. So it's one of the few docks the Royal Navy has which can lift Hood. And I'm fairly certain so can Admiralty floating dock number 8 at Malta. The reason I say that is because it and 9 are ordered at similar times, and because the only photos I have of Hood actually going through dry docking all come from her time in a floating dock at Malta. Then in World War II, they build floating dock number 11, which had a lifting capacity of 60,000 tons. Originally had been built for the Southern Railway. It's taken over by the Admiralty in 1939 because the Admiralty would really like the lifting capacity of 60,000 tons. And remember, the great thing about the floating docks is they can move. So you can build them in the UK and take them to where you need them, and you can take them where you want from after that. Admiralty floating dock number 17, built in Devonport, goes to Reykjavik, then is moved to Sydney. It can lift destroyers, which you're probably sitting there going, but surely you need these for bigger ships. You do, but you also need them for destroyers. And do you want to destroy using up a facility which you require for a bigger ship? No. You need them, and you need your destroyers maintained just as much as you need your battleships. In fact, more so, arguably, because the destroyers tend to be going out doing all sorts of other extra stuff. So a 2,750-ton lift capacity floating dock is very useful. And before anyone starts thinking I'm campaigning for the Royal Navy to start building a floating dock, I would love the Royal Navy to have some floating docks, but I think it's more the US Navy which needs them at the moment. The Royal Navy needs to grow in size a bit before it starts getting the point of worrying about floating docks and deployments. We even have one listed, floating dock number 26, as being fabricated in Calcutta, assembled in Bombay, and eventually moved to Iceland in 1995 and still in operation to be scrapped between 21 and 22. And yeah, they even built them post-World War II because they were useful. When they were first looking at nuclear submarines, they built floating dry docks. Admittedly, it's currently being used by Iceland, but they did build one. These are capable, useful things. This is HMS York aboard AFD1 in 1933. This is a capability that no other nation really has in the 1920s and 30s or in the 1900s. The one which has invested in infrastructure all around the world is Britain. Why? Because for Britain in the 1900s, in this period of history, the Navy is not a choice. The Navy is not a would like to have. The Navy is not something which they think, it makes us look good. The Navy is an essential item. You cannot have the world's largest, and let's be honest, maritime empire, because it was held together by the maritime sphere, and not put down the infrastructure for your fleet worldwide. I would argue that when nations stop investing in that sort of infrastructure is when you start putting a time limit on how long they're going to maintain in a top tier role. Because if you're not prepared to invest in the stuff which is not sexy and is going to support the stuff which has teeth, then you're probably not going to be able to support the stuff which has teeth for that much longer either. And then once you can no longer support the teeth, you don't have an empire and you don't have influence. Today, I would argue in Britain's case, again, I'm not asking for a floating dry dock, although it would be so good. But no, the fact is, we only have one dry dock facility realistically for the aircraft carriers, Rosyth. We have 2 aircraft carriers. We only have 2. For starters, that's a problem, but leave that to one side. One is, we have the capability on paper when it's available. 2 is, we usually have the capability available as long as no accidents happen. 3 is, we have the capability available. 4 is, we have the capability at sea ready to rock and roll. 5 is, we usually have the capability at sea. We have the capability at sea to rock and roll, and we usually have at least 1 to 2 vessels which can be available at a short notice because we have now got sufficient mass of crew, of personnel, etc., that we can do that even when we need to surge capacity, we can continue with our pre-planned maintenance program because we always have a surge capacity built into the task, into the force structure. 6 is, woohoo! So, yes, people go, well, we've got 2 on 2, which they're on paper means they're always available. Oh, there's one always available. And I know there's still a bit around, but I'm explaining why this comes back to floating docks and dry docks. Well, yes, they're always available. If one of them has an accident, what happens if it has the accident when Rosyth is already occupied? And if it's not in wartime, you're not going to get the powers or the money from the government to go to a commercial dockyard and go, we need that space right now. You're not. So then you don't actually have any ship. And there's a lot of periods which are below war but have heightened tensions where that could be extremely problematic. This is HMS Hood. This is her in the floating dock. This is her in number 8. I'm reckoning that dock has a capacity of at least 55,000 tons. At least. Interesting point of discussion which comes up is, of course, no one ever actually did use one of the Royal Navy's floating dry docks for construction purposes, but there is potentially that as an option for building larger ships. I.e., you build them in sections, you float them into a floating dry dock, it floats up, you then do the magic around the floating dry dock. Bring the ships together that way. Would have been an interesting idea. And very possibly quite capable. But Hood is, of course, a classic example of a problem for the Royal Navy. And one of the reasons why they were going with the G3s and those designs of vessels is because they didn't have enough dry docks that could take the larger ships. And they didn't think they were going to get the line off that they're supposed to. For example, the Royal Navy was supposed to have another investment round in infrastructure and dry docks in 1916. World War I happened, they didn't get it. Okay, the next scheduled one, because usually it's roughly every 6 years, been 1910, been 1904, been 1898. Roughly every 6 years they seem to go through an investment period. So next scheduled one will be 1922. The RN in 1919 doesn't think it's going to get them in 1922. It thinks if it gets them, the earliest is going to get them is 1924, in which case 2 years from then is when when the stuff be delivered, which would probably mean 1926. But the odds are the Royal Navy's thinking it's going to be 1928 before anything is delivered, if not 1930. Now, maybe they get this earlier, maybe they don't. But you need to design, therefore, your brand new ships around your existing infrastructure. And they have to be as capable as you can, which means they have to be the most efficient design possible. Which is why you end up with the design. Because what's an inefficiency in hull design? The space you have to build between magazines and boiler rooms. You have to maintain that temperature. And you have to do that, you have to have gapping, you have to have insulation. And so if you have to have 2 sets of magazines, because you have the magazines either end of the boiler rooms and the engines, well, that's double that spacing, double that gapping, double that insulation. And that suddenly becomes a chunk of hull space. Plus, of course, that's all adding up to making the ship longer. Which you'd prefer not to. You want to get the most out of the ship you have available. I think also they're looking at the weights, and this is one of the things people look at the spaces and go, ah, yes, but how many facilities do they have that could take these sort of size ships? Well, if you have a dry dock that can take up to 55,000 tons, again, upping it to 60,000 tons is not going to be easy, but it's not as difficult as as probably trying to get through the funding to do it from scratch, especially when you've done the work before in terms of upgrading dry docks. And floating dry docks would have been the basis of it. Let's be honest, this is what Hood depends on. Hood, many of her around the world deployments and many of her larger operations, and this is her in 1937, she depends on the floating dry docks. You can actually chart her movements by where the Royal Navy has the floating dry docks, which can actually accommodate her. Without them, Hood would have been nowhere near as useful. So floating dry docks. They are a different form of infrastructure. Because usually when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about something you build in and it's there. Whereas a floating dry dock is something you build and then take there. Interestingly enough, floating dry docks are to me the more model of what we'll probably see in terms of space docks. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you get to a point at which maybe we have space docks which are self-propelled for ships to go in them. So they can, probably slowly, but move themselves between points where they're needed for maintenance of ships. Because you are going to need maintenance of ships in space, just as you need them on Earth. don't really conceive it at that often because we often don't perceive the sheer amount of maintenance you have to do into orbitals, etc., and other vessels when they come down to Earth before they can go up into space. Yes, I know SpaceX has done a lot of work in making them recoverable, but they still require a lot of maintenance and work to make them go back up there. The Space Shuttle program was a classic example of this. In fact, one of the big problems of the Space Shuttle program was A, the number of orbitals they built versus the number of missions they were expecting to carry out and the length of service they were expecting to do, but B, the focus often on trying to make maintenance as efficient as possible. And yes, maintenance does need to be efficient, but you also need time to spot things. And you either need to build time in to spot the things, or you need to make sure it's maybe a slightly slower progress so people take their time. When people are always racing at a deadline, we all do this, you don't always spot everything. You're human, and humans are part of it, even if you try your best. So, floating docks. They're the infrastructure which, in many ways, the Royal Navy had the most control of. They didn't have to worry about the local government. They didn't have to worry about anything. If they had a dockyard facility, they could float it in. Yes, Bermuda's having a breakwater, etc. put in. But, again, that's a lot easier to get in. Now, what have we got going on here? Well, tomorrow, because this is coming out on the Monday, the 21st of February, will be the forward class. Woohoo! And next Monday there will not be one of these videos. So we go down. This video series stops. But if you have other suggestions for what would you like for Monday videos, please feel free to put them in. I'm just going to make Monday videos to be quirky series, but I don't want to keep them going up constantly because honestly, providing a long patrol video for Monday, for Tuesday, usually a UAD themed answering question video for Friday, a live for Thursday, and a long patrol version of the live for Saturday, and a live for Sunday means most weeks I'm producing 6 videos, and if I actually get round to starting up the 4 random books again and getting through them like I'm planning to, or 4 random books, or the book or 2 to review series, I'm going to do one of them, then that's 7 videos a week. And that's a lot. That's a lot more time than I should be, in a way, putting in there. I love it. I love talking to you all. I love sharing the stuff with you. But I have got my new book project, which I'm working on. And I am prepping and looking forward to Canada, going to see HMCS Haida. I am setting up things for that to be funded and sorting out that. And hopefully giving a public talk while I'm out there, which will be fun. And if I can, I'm going to set it up so I can rope in Drac as well into a public talk, so you have both of us giving into a public talk. And it's all a lot of fun, but Mondays are going to be, how do I put it, special series. If I do them, it's going to be a special series, and they're all going to be put together. And as I said, there might be a 5th episode of this come out, but if it does, it won't be next Monday. It'll be after I've had time to collate all the wonderful pictures that are being sent in of the infrastructure and can discuss it all properly. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're enjoying the long patrols I'm doing. I hope you're enjoying the videos I'm putting out. And I hope you're having a good time. Take care, everyone. If I manage to stop talking quickly enough, this will all be over within an hour, which makes YouTube very happy when it's uploading, because for some reason videos over an hour take a lot longer for it to check than videos which are just under an hour. It could be 59 minutes and 45 seconds, it'll take a lot less time to be checked than something which is 60 minutes and 2 seconds. Take care.